this cage, a split-second decision can change a career. But those decisions aren't accidents. They're calculations. Whether it's a championship veteran or a massive underdog, there's always a blueprint for victory. And we're here to find it. It's time to break down all that's happened, all that's coming up, and all that's in MMA's headlines. This is Fight IQ. And now, here's your host, Tom Albano.
Welcome to another edition of Fight IQ here on the Empty the Bench Podcast Network. I apologize for coming in a little bit late there. Crazy stuff going on right now, so we're going to just, we're just going to go on with that. Apologies for stumbling in a little bit late there in terms of where I come in with the intro. Lot to talk about today, so we're not going to waste too much time. And we got some big breaking news, unfortunate, sad breaking news to talk about on today's show. We have a lot that we got to go through, so I'm just going to intro you very quick. Hit like, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified of everything here at the Empty the Bench Podcast Network. That's every episode of Fight IQ, the Puncher's Chance. To be determined when we're going to do Puncher's Chance this week, if we're going to do Puncher's Chance this week. Because obviously we got another PFL card coming up on Friday, and then Saturday we're getting hit with the triple header of MVP boxing, Zuffa boxing, and a UFC fight night. So we will see what happens with Puncher's Chance this week. Follow on social media for updates on when that is going to take place. So appropriately follow us on social media at FightIQ ETB, at ETB Network. If you are watching us on X platforms, by the way, shout out to all of you. Make sure to come over to the YouTube home. That's youtube.com. There it is, /ETB Network. And again, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified of everything. Hey, ETB Network just passed 1,150 subscribers. You can help us continue our climb up, help us continue to grow on the YouTube platform. And as I mentioned before, scrolling across the little ticker right now, you can follow us at FightIQ ETB and at ETB Network, and you can follow me on social media at Thomas J. Albano. All right. Unfortunately, now normally if there was just some sort of breaking news thing, I would play the little alarm and do all the ETB Network things. That's all here and good. But this news is not so good. So I'm just going to go right into it right now. Alan Nascimento, UFC flyweight known as Piotr Oso, just fought last month at the UFC Apex. It was 1 week, actually not even 1 week, 6 days after the UFC White House card. Alan Nascimento has passed away. According to the UFC, Alan Nascimento, who was 34, he was to turn 35 next month, passed away of a heart attack in his sleep. Alan Nascimento was a UFC flyweight. According to Tapology, where was he on Tapology's rankings? Did he have a ranking on Tapology? 22-7. I cannot find what his ranking was on Tapology. if he was. Zen, if you are listening, maybe you can help me figure that out. He was not ranked by the UFC. He fought last month. I mean, not last month. About a month and a half ago, UFC Fight Night on June 20th, losing a split decision to Mitch Raposo. It was about that many people thought, at least on the Tapology predictions, that he was to win. Ended up losing a very close fight, split decision, and it is undoubtedly a tragic day in the UFC. I mean, this is an active fighter, under their banner who has now passed away. Uh, 22-7 career. Ended up going, I think it's 4-2 in the octagon. Yeah, 4-2. Made his UFC debut in October of 2021 at UFC 267, losing a split decision to Tagir Ulanbekov, who was a ranked flyweight. Scored victories over Jake Hadley, Carlos Hernandez, Jafel Filo, and Cody Durden. And he actually ended up earning 2 performance bonuses in the UFC in his first round submission of Hernandez and his second round submission of Durden. That win over Durden actually taken place this past November. I believe that was UFC Vegas 110. I think that was one of the highlights of that card. Yeah. And as I mentioned, he fought Mitch Raposo, competitive bout in June at the Apex, and ended up losing a very close split decision. That was at the Cop Horiguchi 2 card. First of all, my heartfelt condolences go out to everybody on his team, all of his family, his loved ones, his friends, everyone at Jukebox, where he trained at. And, you know, somebody like Alan Nascimento, you saw excellent jiu-jitsu ability with what he showed out in the octagon. As I mentioned, he had some pretty stellar submissions. It's a shame that, unfortunately, a lot of his fights ended up falling through for one reason or another. Between 2023 and 2025, he fought out Carlos Hernandez in January 2023, and he didn't fight again. The Filo fight took place in May of 2025. For a number of reasons, a number of matchups just consistently fell through for one reason or another, that being Tim Elliott, Sunamraji, and Asu Amabayev, a couple of top names that are there in the flyweight rankings. Or Tim Elliott at one point was, Asu Amabayev is. Jafil Fio, actually, there was a fight with him that did end up getting canceled. They did end up rebooking that, as I mentioned. And then Amabayev ended up getting rescheduled. And think about the flyweight scene on the UFC, ever since it was sort of rebuilt, if you want to call it that, within the 2020s. He's been a fighter where he, even though he hasn't fought too often, when he fights, he does fight impressively. That reflects on the skill that you see in the flyweight division. So Alan Nascimento really was somebody who was, fun to watch. And it's a real shame that, we're not going to see that, because a fight between him and Sunraji, or a fight between him and Tim Elliott, still would have been interesting. And he ended up, like I said, 22-7 career. He actually made his debut in professional MMA back in 2011, won 7 straight fights before his first loss, which is actually in a title fight in 2013. Ended up winning then 6 of his next 7, fought in XFC, fought in Legacy Fighting Championships. That was where he lost that one title fight, which was the predecessor to what we now know today as the LFA, one of the big feeder leagues for the UFC. He actually, I believe, did compete in Ryzen. Yeah, he did. He fought in Ryzen in 2016, losing by decision to Yuki Motoya. And then he actually had an appearance on Dana White's Contender Series back in 2018, where he lost a split decision to Rolian Paiva. So, I mean, there's nothing else I can really say other than that this is a tragic day in the world of mixed martial arts. This is a tragic day in the world of the UFC. And I'm sitting here puzzled at the fact that somebody just 34 years old, not much older than me, ends up dying of a heart attack in his sleep. It doesn't feel real. Like it doesn't, like you scratch your head, you wonder, like, how does that happen? And it's just a reminder of why we need to not take every day for granted and not take what's around us for granted, because one of these days, it's not going to be there. One of these days, people in our lives are not going to be there. So my condolences go out to everyone who knew Alan, and rest in peace. Thank you, Chrissy. Yes, may he rest in peace. We're going to move on now to the big story that we had intended to lead today off with, which honestly, if you saw the last edition of Puncher's Chance on Thursday, we ended up spending much of it on this anyway, and that is that the Professional Fighters League is merging with Most Valuable Promotions. So obviously the PFL has undergone a lot of changes ever since John Martin took over the reins of CEO of that promotion about 13 months ago. We saw plenty of changes going, from the, removal of the tournament formats, the folding of PFL Europe, and then going into, trying to make sure that we have the best fights possible, not needing no sort of tournament. Now, PFL MENA and PFL Africa are still around. And when I was there at PFL New York, which I will talk about in just a little bit, basically, he was asked about, what is going to be the fate of those regional focused promotions, those building grounds, if you will, proving grounds, if you will, that serve as the building blocks for some MMA talent, younger MMA talent in those regions. And John Martin could not give an answer. He said that's still to be determined. And I guess my instinct was, if PFL Europe folded and MVP, I don't think is going to do that kind of expansion style format. I don't think those sub-promotion, regional promotions, whatever you want to call it, are for long. I think what you're going to see with MVP and what it sounds like you're going to see, according to some of these early reports, are just traditional professional MMA cards like you see with the UFC, where you're going to promote the best fighting the best. And Paul and Bedarian have both talked about how under this new change, a new regime, if you will, you're still going to see that MVP focus, like we talked about, when Fight IQ first launched around the time of MVP MMA's first show, that they are going to be a promotion for the fighters. Better opportunities, better pay, and alternative product. And I think that's the biggest thing to all of this. And it sounds like, according to some of these stories from Helwani to Martin himself, that these negotiations have actually been going on for a while. In the weeks before, we had, and actually just days before, when we talked about last week's show, I had said, this rumor was going around at some point in July. I think it was Front Row Brian on Twitter who first talked about this. And last Monday, I told you guys, I had heard rumors about a partnership, like Front Row Brian heard. This is a little more than a partnership. This is going to be complete brand integration, where the PFL is going to be moving into the MVP umbrella. And all that we've talked about with MVP MMA, well, MVP MMA was its own thing for one event. And now the PFL is going to rebrand into MVP MMA beginning in January of 2027. John Martin has added that, and if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments, and I can try to answer to the best of my ability what I know about this situation between what I covered from the PFL New York card and what we've been reading, what's been talked about with Helwani. I talked about by Helwani, by John Martin, by Jake Paul himself, Badarian, etc. I may not be able to provide all the answers, and some of those answers I'm trying to figure out for myself. But what I do know is also everything I said, plus that PFL, how they were crowning champions, throughout this entire year, trying to get one champion in all of the divisions in this transition that they've been going from the World Tournament format, the Don Davis era, the Peter Murray era, into the John Martin era of what PFL would be. Those are going to continue. And the champions who are champions in the PFL come the end of 2026 will become the inaugural MVP MMA world champion. So, for instance, Thad Gene, who a couple weeks ago in Washington, D.C., won the PFL welterweight title. Come January, he is going to be the MVP MMA welterweight champion of the world. The roster basically is going to remain the same. Everything is just going to move from being PFL brand to MVP brand. And as I talked about on Thursday, it kind of makes somewhat of sense that these two are going to be unifying. Now, when you're somebody who is always, for the fighters and wants to see more opportunity and other, promotions out there, you kind of feel sad because you would have hoped that MVP MMA would be its own thing. So that way you would have, MVP MMA, PFL, UFC, rise in different promotion options out there for all these different fighters. Now there's one less. But when you consider that MVP didn't really have too much of a roster, you had that one card, which was fairly loaded, but it goes to something that I had mentioned, when talking about that card on here and talking about what the future of MVP would be in an MMA sense. I know it was asked about on ETB Lounge, and I gave my thoughts to Callan. I gave my thoughts to people here at the network, and I said the one concern I would have with MVP would be you can't just rely on the big names. And even Ariel Helwani talked about it in his reaction to the breaking news. You need the mix. You need the mix of recognizable talent and young, hungry prospects that you can build up and be, homegrown talent. That Gene is a great example. Patrick Cabarrora is a great example. An even greater example, she just fought in the co-main event of PFL New York, Dakota Ditcheva. So there are multiple examples of homegrown talents that the PFL has been trying to push and get behind and be the faces of their promotion. And it would be smart if MVP, do they need to use Jake Paul's ability to grab headlines and, all his money to attract some bigger name talent out there? Sure. But in what is a perfect example, I forget if Helwani or James Lynch had mentioned it, I don't want to see a roster full of Tony Fergusons. Guys who are way past their prime and still going at it, even if they have the star power. You need a solid mix of talent. That's something that would really be beneficial to MVP if they really are trying to combine forces. And then, we talked about how the PFL is a solid number 2 option. But at least I feel they're solid, but at the same time, people look at it and say that they are a default number 2. And something to recognize, and I think even John Martin recognizes it. It's not like UFC here, PFL here, MVP here, where there's equidistant, kind of competition. It's UFC is up here, way up here, and then you've got PFL here and MVP here. And the reason I'm ranking it like that is because, MVP, they had, Ronda Rousey and Gina Carano. But again, you're not going, and Nate Diaz with Mike Perry's the co-main event. Francis Ngannou in the featured bout prior to the main and co-main. But again, you're not going to get Ronda Rousey, Gina Carano, Nate Diaz, Mike Perry, Francis Ngannou on every single card. And I don't mean just together. I also mean that some of these cards, look at the UFC Apex cards, where some of these younger guys are more, if they're if it's a UFC fight night in a specific international region, you have a specific fighter from that region sometimes main eventing, even if they're not the highest ranked fighter. You might have situations where you're not going to have somebody on the level of a Mike Perry or a Francis Ngannou, competing in the main event. You may have cards where, and especially when you talk about the importance of championships and title fights, somebody like a Thad Gene, somebody like an Usman Nurmagomedov, like a Dakota Ditcheva, main eventing some of these cards. And that's why it's important to show, that's why it's important to really get behind your talent, homegrown talent. That's why it's important to have prospects. That's why it's important to have younger fighters. That's why it's important for a promotion to really push these names there and give them these kinds of opportunities that they may not get elsewhere. And one thing I can say for the benefit of MVP is that, the PFL has the roster, but MVP, like I mentioned, they have Jake Paul. You're like, but it's Jake Paul. I know. I wasn't always his biggest fan either. But again, you need to root for these guys. If you are somebody who really dislikes the UFC just being, way up here, then you need to root for PFL and MVP and all these other guys. And Scott Coker is going to come back in 2027, if y'all forget. That Strike MMA, whatever the project name is, he's planning to make another return in 2027. So that's another outlet that's going to be out there for fighters. My point being, the UFC, yes, is the dominant number one. But sometimes that really harms an economy. And I don't mean a, government national-based economy like the United States economy. I'm just talking about the economy within an industry. And we need more than just, TKO dominating at the top with the Ultimate Fighting Championship. If you're somebody who wants to see a healthy economy, options for fans, options for fighters, people might look at me and say, I am sick for saying this. And, people have told me that it sounds so sick to say, but it is true. Then you need to root for Jake Paul to succeed. You need to root for this merger to be a great thing. And one thing that Jake Paul can provide, which I actually talked about on Thursday, is more opportunity also in terms of making money. When you looked at that PFL MVP, if you look at that MVP card from back in May, you looked at those lower fighters, those prelim level fighters, they were making about $40,000. That's like 4 times more than what the lowest prelim fighters are making on some of these UFC cards. That's what's important, is people who are starting off in their career, they don't have to be making chump change and not getting anything in the end. They can actually make a little bit something decent for themselves, competing on however many cards that they'll compete. I believe the plan is for at least 1 card a month for MVP, PFL MVP, actually, no, what did I say on Thursday? MVPFL Bellator. MVPF Bellator. Try saying that 5 times fast. So it's, I want to see this company succeed. John Mard, by the way, will stay on as CEO for MVP MMA. Paul and Badarian retain their co-founder boards, co-founder roles, and board seats. John Martin will also get a board seat. And, can MVP realistically challenge the UFC? Not immediately. But hopefully they can build something solid for themselves. Let's talk about PFL New York. Oh man, this was so much fun. This was a lot of fun to cover in person. Going there was a little rough. Traveling from my hometown into Long Island took about 2.5 hours. It was a rough ride. What I mean, when you're going into Long Island on a Friday afternoon, yeah, you should expect it to be a rough ride, especially during the summertime. And you got people going off into the Hamptons, everybody trying to get somewhere nice and sunny, beachy for the weekend. It is what it is. Getting there, however, I think was probably just the biggest challenge, because then you got there and everything was nice. The PFL folks were very hospitable. They were very welcoming. Brought us down to the area where we were. We were on the floor, but we were still several rows behind some of the fans. But I guess that was to allow us easy access where we can go up out of one of the floor exits and travel down a hallway where we could go to the media room, where they had stuff set up for us. And that's where all the post-fight interviews ended up taking place. That's the room that you may have been seeing if you've been looking at my social media, where John Martin was doing a scrum and we were asking him questions. Dakota Ditcheva was doing a scrum. We were asking him questions. And at some other outlets, you might have seen one with Usman Nurmagomedov. Actually, I posted a funny video of me. I didn't. It wasn't a photo a video that I took. It was a video from, let me get their name correctly, the Casuals MMA podcast, where one of their own was standing right next to me when Usman Nurmagomedov was doing his post-fight scrum. And we're just all the two of us are just raising our hands and just not getting called on. Like, we're in a bad spot. I'm just gonna cough real loud, and maybe he'll notice us. And I'm just chuckling, like, do it. Unfortunately, it just did not work. But I wasn't bothered by it. I hope nobody who saw that took it out of context that I was sad. It sucked, but I was laughing about it. Like, it's funny. That's how the fight media game goes, people. I got to hang out with some former colleagues and fellow, MMA media who I know from group chats and social media that I actually got to meet in person for the first time. That was awesome. It was a hell of a lot of fun. John Martin seemed to say, hey, we're going to come back out to Long Island, because John Martin grew up around Long Island. Was an Islanders fan, and the Islanders of the 80s, the Dynasty Islanders, were his team. So hopefully, first I'll just say to the PFL, thank you. And hopefully around same time next year, I would love to go. I would love another New York card. That would be fantastic. Speaking of the New York card, let's talk about the New York card. So Usman Nurmagomedov retaining his lightweight championship, first round knockout of Archie Colgan. One of the things that I wanted to talk about with Usman Nurmagomedov, if I did get the chance to talk with him, is about his striking. And, I kind of talked about it on Puncher's Chance on Thursday. Usman Nurmagomedov, and you hear the name Nurmagomedov, trained by Khabib, coached by the late great, pardon me, trained by Khabib's father, also may he rest in peace. You think about all that, and you think about their grappling, because that's what Abdul Manap And that's what Khabib Nurmagomedov are known for at their martial arts training, and Khabib's own career in MMA with the UFC was his grappling. But I had also mentioned on Thursday, hey, don't underestimate Usman Nurmagomedov's, kickboxing abilities, because he can be slick. And that's what won this fight for him against Archie Colgan. It was his kickboxing ability. His striking was on clear display. And you saw, if you looked at the finishing sequence, the solid uppercut that Usman Nurmagomedov landed. And he was able to round and pound his way to the victory. And another talent from the region, Amru Magomedov, also competed at the PFL New York card. He was fighting Angel Alvarez, and he ended up getting the finish. Why? Because of his striking. And John Martin was really praiseworthy of Amru Magomedov in that competition, because he was landing so many leg kicks. And it's like, you don't really think about striking when you think of Nurmagomedov name. And he even credited Usman for that as well. The striking of these guys. Hell, if I want to throw an example from the UFC, we've seen it with Islam Makhachev. I'm interested to see if we'll see it on display against Ian Gary in a couple of weeks' time. I don't know. But you think back to when Islam Makhachev fought Alexander Volkanovski the second time around. He knocked him out clean. So what they have done with Khabib's training, what they've done as a team, is unbelievable. And we can't sleep on their kickboxing anymore, people. We can't. And then you got Dakota Ditcheva. Maybe not the strongest of performances. Definitely had a little bit of ring rust, I would say, after, but obviously this was her first fight back in a year. Last year she fought in Africa, ended up injuring her hand in that fight. So this was her first time back on the scene. And the other thing is, I saw a lot of people on social media completely trashing Denise Kielholtz. I know Denise Kielholtz is an older fighter. I know Denise Kielholtz came from the world of kickboxing, not the most traditional, MMA, say traditional, but not the most, typical MMA base in the modern day. Can't say traditional martial arts, because kickboxing is a traditional martial art. That's going to be part of my problem, is that everyone laughed at Denise Kielholtz. Like, this should be an easy fight for her. I feel like a lot of people underestimate Denise Kielholtz. Like, is she going to win every fight? No. Is she one of the best at the women's flyweights in the MMA scene? No. But she's a solid veteran, won multiple championships in the sport of kickboxing. I feel like she gives a lot tougher of fights than people give credit for. And Dakota, to her credit, knew she was going to be in for a tough fight. And as much as she tried to land power shots, she could not get the better of Denise Kielholtz. And to Denise's credit, she actually took Dakota down in round number 3. So some stuff to work on with Dakota. But when you have the first fight back, after a long layoff, and I think it was the first long layoff of her career, especially with such global stage and global stakes, I feel like forgiveness has to be held. And to Dakota's credit, she said, I want to get back in there. That was a clip that I posted the other day on social media, interviewing Dakota, and she told a couple of us, she expects that her next fight, first of all, she doesn't want to wait for the merger. She wants another fight before the end of this year. She is looking at November, December range, probably December, because I would expect a few, 2 or 3 PFL cards in December. That happened last year between the MENA Championships, the Africa Championships, and the Europe Championships being featured on as a global PFL event. So I would expect probably the same thing, especially now that we know December PFL MMA is going to wrap up in favor of MVP MMA. So on that note, I think Dakota said, 5 rounds with Liz Carmouche. And in my opinion, that is the fight to make. Liz Carmouche has flirted with 135. She is advocating to the PFL, I guess now MVP, for a women's bantamweight division. I don't think that's a terrible thing, and I don't blame Liz because Liz was a women's bantamweight fighter at one point. Liz was Ronda Rousey's opponent back in 2013 when Ronda Rousey made her UFC debut. That first UFC women's bantamweight title fight, or just UFC women's title fight, period. It involved Liz Carmouche. She is a pioneer of this sport. And I think that's what makes this fight so interesting. Liz Carmouche, pioneer of the sport in the modern era, somebody who has held gold in Bellator, now into the PFL, and now her against somebody like Dakota Ditcheva, PFL Europe champion, PFL World Tournament champion, or pardon me, regular season champion, because she won it in 2024, and regular season playoff champion, I should say. And then Dakota Ditcheva, she is being promoted as the future of the sport. She is being promoted as the face of the PFL, if not one of the faces of the PFL. This matchup has so much stakes to it and could be so fun that it just seems logical to make. So you know what? That's fine. If they don't want to wait for the merger, that's fine. Would it have been cool to see this fight on the first, MVP MMA card in January? Yeah, but you know what? To wrap up the PFL era at some point in December with a fight like this, I say go for it. Let's see Dakota Ditcheva versus Liz Carmouche in December for the championship. Now, I have not said anything about Usman Nurmagomedov. That's because, for those of you who are not aware of contract talks within our industry, Usman Nurmagomedov is now a free agent. He has fulfilled his contractual obligations to the Professional Fighters League. He made 2 fights. He had 2 fights left on his contract, which he fought, and retained the championship against Archie Colgan and Alfie Davis this year. And now here he is, ready for free agency. And here's one thing I will say negative about Jake Paul and about this merger. You saw what happened in the cage at the end of that fight. Usman Nurmagomedov got his hand raised, got the belt placed on his shoulder by Khabib. And then you saw the post-fight interview where it was basically very blatantly and clearly asked, hey, your contract with us is up. That was made mention by Usman. What happens next? And Usman blatantly said in the cage, MVP and Jake Paul are always talking about how they can show fighters money. Well, show me the money, he basically told Jake Paul. What did Jake Paul tell him in the cage? Hey, if you win your next fight, I'll buy you a car. And that's something that Jake Paul has done with a couple of young fighters in the MVP world, with MVP boxing, MVPW specifically. We have seen that, and it's just something that, may work for a younger fighter who's trying to make a name for themselves. But somebody like Usman Nurmagomedov, where the UFC could be calling, it doesn't work. And by the way, the UFC did come calling, it seems. Not explicitly stated, but Dana White was asked at the post-fight press conference for UFC Belgrade. He was asked in Serbia, hey, Usman Nurmagomedov's contract is up at PFL. Is this somebody you want? And Dana White just had a one-word answer. He said, sure. And then he just had like a very big grin on his face. And then that was amplified, in a follow-up post. I guess Champions Rounds took that clip, put it on their Twitter profile, and Dana White responded to them with a big happy grin emoji. Like, oh, that tells me he wants it. He would look, after all the noise that PFL and MVP has made this week in the headlines, oh, he really wants to stick it to them. I mean, why wouldn't he want Usman Nurmagomedov? 22-0, still in his late 20s. He's trained by Khabib, who had his own 29-0 MMA career, and Dana still wishes to this day for one more fight for Khabib Nurmagomedov so that he could have ended his MMA career 30-0. But Usman's young. He's still in his late 20s, which John Martin talked about at the post-fight press conference. And he is one of the best fighters, not just lightweights, one of the best fighters that's not only not under UFC contract, but has never been under UFC contract. And Usman Nurmagomedov, some people feel, John Martin included, that Usman Nurmagomedov, if you had him face Justin Gaethje in a dream champion versus champion matchup, there are some people out there who would pick Usman Nurmagomedov to defeat Justin Gaethje in such a dream matchup. And it's not honestly a bad take. Some people, especially the UFC diehards, might call it a bad take and say that John Martin's crazy. I don't think he's too crazy. I mean, after all, Khabib beat Justin in his retirement fight. So Khabib knows about Justin's style. He knows that he has such an eye for MMA as well that Coach Khabib would know the way for Usman Nurmagomedov to have success against somebody like a Justin Gaethje. Now, if he goes over to the UFC, he's not going to get a title fight right away. Should he get somebody like a top 5 talent, though, and have them be a featured fight on a UFC numbered card? Absolutely. That's what should happen, because that's how you promote somebody like an Usman Nurmagomedov, who, if they steal Usman Nurmagomedov, they steal the man that PFL has been promoting as its pound for pound best fighter in the world. So it just makes sense. But when you are basically, Jake Paul is making the kind of remark that he did about the car, and then basically promoting the idea of him beating Justin Gaethje, when, by the way, Justin Gaethje was in Archie Golkin's corner. And Usman Nurmagomedov is somebody who has great respect for Justin Gaethje. It's like a clash of styles. Usman Nurmagomedov is not the kind of person to talk trash about somebody. Jake Paul is brash. Jake Paul is bold. Jake Paul will go straight to your face if he has a problem. Jake Paul will go straight to your face and tell you what he thinks of you. And, John Martin was asked about that too, about, the merger. If I could actually go back to the merger segment for just a second. He was asked about that, and he said, Jake Paul's going to do his thing and I'm going to do mine. Fair enough. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Usman Nurmagomedov, and my prediction is he will go to the UFC. Now, could you think about what MVP can provide? Like I said, Jake Paul has the money, and Usman Nurmagomedov basically told him, show me the money. Well, could they leverage it? Maybe. Do I think the UFC is willing to give a little bit more money for somebody like Usman Nurmagomedov and the talent he provides and his family name? Yes, absolutely. Will they offer it? I don't know. Because if they don't offer it, then MVP has an opportunity right there to swoop things up. I just think they're on a really bad, cold kind of start. I do want to go back again, as I mentioned, to the PFL MVP merger segment, because the other thing, which actually is something I should have talked about earlier, is I talked about it on Thursday, the situation with the U.S. broadcasting rights. The U.S. broadcasting rights with ESPN expires at the end of this year, and I mentioned on Thursday, and actually John Martin reiterated it to me at the post-fight press conference on Friday. He stands by what he has said in the past about ESPN. You think of the awful announcing article where he basically admitted, ESPN has not done a pretty good job of promoting us. And part of that could be because the UFC left ESPN for Paramount, and That's why I played the Ariel Helwani clip last week. Helwani talked about it last year on his show. ESPN does not deal with number twos. They always say they have the number one everything, number one reporters, number one sports content, number one leagues. Maybe the reporters part is a little much considering what's happened recently to them. But, that's why it looks like they could go off to a place like a Netflix or a Fox. Well, now they're in business with Jake Paul, and Jake Paul has a working relationship with ESPN via MVPW, the boxing promotion that he runs. The MVPW has a broadcasting contract with ESPN. Their next card is this Saturday. So could that change things? And as I mentioned to John Martin, and I don't know, if you follow sports media, if you follow the industry of media, you may have seen an announcement late last week. Actually, no, it probably been about midweek last week, that people who are subscribed to YouTube TV now get ESPN Unlimited. That, $29.99 thing that ESPN offers, that's the only way that you can see things like WWE PLEs, for instance, and some other exclusive content. Things that are more than just ESPN Plus if you are somebody who is a cord cutter like I am. Well, now if you have a YouTube TV subscription, you can get all of ESPN Unlimited and such. You can access that through YouTube TV at no additional cost. So now that's another opportunity for audience, if you will. Maybe that could be attractive to them. I don't know. And I talked about it with colleagues, and I mentioned it to Nick when he was in the chat on Thursday. If you guys saw my rant on the last edition of Fight IQ, I stand by that too. Is this a realistic option? Sure, but there's a lot of make good that they have to do with the MMA fans. There is a lot of bad blood still stewing from the way that production was and the way that things were handled, even when they had the UFC. So I personally don't want them to do ESPN. Now, I was thinking last week, but when it was just a partnership and not the full-fledged thing, that maybe Fox could be in on this. Netflix was a little bit of a pipe dream, but I talked about all these things, how they would feel if, on Netflix, because Netflix is the home to WWE Raw. And, big wrestling, yeah, but WWE is under TKO. Who's their sibling promotion in TKO? The UFC. So imagine a corporate synergy style thing where a UFC fighter is in the crowd at a Monday Night Raw. How do you think MVP and PFL would feel about such a thing? But I guess it works the same way over at ESPN when you consider that ESPN has the WWE PLEs. I hate TKO. Look, Chrissy, it's just, it as a wrestling fan. Like, when you look about the potential negotiations for U.S. broadcasting rights with PFL, it's a really weird kind of relationship because, Netflix is a rival to Paramount. So, hey, we could go there because that's UFC's rival. But TKO has a presence on there too. So UFC's going to sort of have a presence with any WWE UFC synergy stuff. So it's like they're promoting your rival. But at the same time, if you go over to ESPN or you remain with ESPN, well, ESPN now has the U.S. broadcasting rights for all the WWE PLE. So it's like there's no way out of this. So that's why, now that we know that this merger is a thing, Netflix, they have to get on Netflix. Maybe not all 12 or so events, whatever they're going to have in a year, but at least a split between Netflix and some sort of outlet, maybe ESPN because they already have MVPW, where your ESPN cards are the stuff that, like I mentioned before, Your Thad Jeans, your Patrick Haberoras are your headliners, almost like your fight nights, if you will, that you see with UFC. And an MVP or your big on Netflix would be your big cards, where you have 2 or 3 title fights on a night, or a perfect transition where you have maybe Jake Paul competing. Yes, according to John Martin, during the press conference from Friday night, Jake Paul. Sorry, 1 second, guys. According to John Martin, during the post-fight press conference that I talked to him and others talked to him at the on Friday night, Jake Paul, he was signed to PFL at one point during the Don Davis, Peter Murray era. He ended up getting out of that contract along with multiple other things when John Martin took over this past year, which he's called chaotic in a good ways. Now that they have this working relationship, Jake Paul, an MMA debut is still going to be a thing. Jake Paul has talked about he still wants to do a pro MMA fight. That may happen in 2027. So there's a chance that first MVP card on Netflix, wherever it may be, we could one of the first MVP MMA cards, we could see Jake Paul in the cage. Having said that, and why I said I don't know, I corrected myself and said I don't know if it would be the first, but one of the first. That is because Jake Paul, according to John Martin, is still interested in one more boxing match some point this year, within these last 5 months of 2026. We have not seen Jake Paul in a boxing ring since he was knocked out by Anthony Joshua. So that's going to be really interesting to see what kind of talent is out there for a boxing match with Jake Paul this year, plus an MMA fight at some point next year. Jake Paul's got a solid wrestling base. He's got a solid wrestling background. But, going up against somebody who, is somebody who's really, really trained within MMA, if he's going to fight somebody like, let's say, Nate Diaz, they fought in boxing and they want to do a rematch in MMA. Same could go for Mike Perry, especially because who knows if Conor McGregor versus Mike Perry is even going to be a thing in BKFC anymore. I highly doubt it. This could be an option. So yeah, a lot remains to be seen. He's eventually going to get fights in both. He's going to get another boxing match. He's going to make his debut. That's going to be one of the selling points to somebody like Netflix within 2027. Paul himself stepping into the MMA cage. Let's go over to the UFC Belgrade recap. One of the craziest events of this UFC calendar year. New modern UFC record for most finishes at a UFC event. 12 of the 14 fights ended with a finish. 12 of the 14 fights did not see the final bell. 10 of those were first round finishes. I think it's the first time in the history of the UFC, going back to 1993, where we have double-digit first-round finishes in a night. It was unbelievable. And, of course, the headline attraction of that was Uros Medic, the doctor. Only took 30 seconds. Landed a hard shot on Daniel Rodriguez. D-Rod went down. Just needed some follow-up flurry. And that did it. Uros Medic sent the Serbian crowd into a frenzy. For the first time, we had flares in the crowd of a UFC event, which is crazy to see. But the people in Serbia love Uros. And now that he beat Daniel Rodriguez, you're going to see Uros fight somebody in the top 10 next. That's what has to happen. Actually, I do want to go back to the PFL recap, by the way, because I also do want to make mention of one more name from this past weekend. Mustafa Diakate making his PFL debut. First fight of the main card. The aura that he had, coming out with his cultural garb and the music that was playing, leading him to the cage. It was something out of another world. And then, the power that he has at 205, the way that he just demolished Darrell Walker. was insane. And even John Martin admitted that's somebody who we might have to get behind, especially in this time of merger. And you're talking about other names that are out there and younger fighters to promote. All right. Unfortunately, I have to go to some non-fun stuff. And that is the arrest of Anthony Lionheart Smith that took place over some point last week. So what we know already about these charges, I'm going to go to the Body Lock. Man, that's a site I haven't been on in a while. So Smith was arrested in Nebraska earlier in the week. I believe he was arrested actually on Thursday. Actually, I believe it wasn't long after we got off the air that the news had dropped. Yeah, it wasn't long off the air. Forget what I was doing, but I was doing something else on Thursday, and that's when I saw the news drop. I'm like, oh, crap. Anthony Smith arrested in his home state of Nebraska. 3 felony charges. The 38-year-old fighter was booked in Sarpy County Jail on charges of terroristic threats, false imprisonment, and first-degree domestic violence. He was released on bond for $500,000, appeared before a judge on Friday. Faces up to 20 years in prison, depending on potential convictions from each of the 3 different felony counts. Supposedly, the circumstances are Anthony Smith allegedly tried to force his wife back home with him from a bar. The wife reportedly basically refused to go home with him, and Anthony Smith responded by yelling at her, threatening to kill her, and using his vehicle to potentially run her over. Anthony Smith later turned himself into police. Anthony Smith's wife basically had then made some post on social media where she basically said, I made the call to help him. I'm afraid of him. Not I'm afraid of him, but I'm afraid of him for himself. Scary scene. Dana White was asked about it during the weekend, and he just said it can happen to anybody. Personal experience, it can happen to anybody. I just hope it works out for him and his family and his kids. Dana White reflecting on his own previous, run-in and issues with domestic violence during that one New Year's Eve video with his wife. Smith's case was still pending as of the time of that article. It's tough, man, because, like what I talked about with the arrest of Dustin Poirier, and the arrest of Dustin Poirier, that was just him being drunk and belligerent in an airport. This is basically attempted murder, and that's not excusable by any means. And if Anthony Smith really did do this, he needs to face the penalties. He needs to face his time. Why it's so difficult to say this, because Anthony Smith is also a good guy within the sport, or at least was a good guy within the sport. And you just think about, all the damage. Anthony Smith had a very long MMA career. Is this another case of somebody displaying, CTE attributed characteristics and decision-making? Unfortunately, we never know, because CTE does not get officially diagnosed until after somebody passes away. It's sad, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. I hope he gets the help he needs. More importantly, I hope his wife and his kids are okay. Ian Gary has also found himself in a bit of a spotlight. Basically, he was on a podcast, and he had made mention of, how he cries while watching Disney movies, and says, hey, the world would be a much better, simpler place if it were run by women. And that has sparked a whole lot of debate, and it seemed like Dana White was disparaging him a little bit, what is it, a subtle shot? And, when your boss is Dana White, what do you expect is going to happen? Unfortunately, And I don't know, man. It feels like Ian Gary is doing disservices for himself when doing this kind of, media tour that he's doing, just because of who makes up the majority of the MMA fan base and the personalities you see in fighters and the personality you see in fans and even executives like Dana White. So this guy might be a tough one for Ian Gary. All I know is if Ian Gary is going on the tour that like he is right now, he better have a great showing against Islam Makhachev at UFC 330. Not this coming Saturday, but next Saturday. Speaking of events, all right, we're going into the 1 hour mark, so we're running into overtime. Let's quickly do this. What is it? Yeah, PTI style, the big finish. UFC 331 has been officially announced for September 19th. Finally officially announced like 7 weeks before it actually is going to happen. Reports, we don't have an official main event. The UFC has not confirmed anything. We do have a report that the Joshua Alex Pantoja flyweight title fight will finally happen on this card. Obviously, they fought once before back in December, but Joshua won the championship in seconds because of injury to Alex Pantoja. The other thing is Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. They will have a rematch supposedly at this card. It will be 5 rounds. However, despite previous reports, there will be no BMF title on the line. On one hand, not shocked because Arman Tsarukyan is in the doghouse with the UFC. So I'm not shocked that they don't want to give him the opportunity for a championship, even the BMF. On the other hand, first of all, they were training for 3 rounds, according to one report. So that's a little bit of a shakeup. And number 2, so is Pantoja 2 the title fight main event, or is there something else? Because Oliveira Tsarukyan 2 doesn't do enough for me in terms of, this is a non-title fight, but we're going to put it above the title fight. That doesn't do it for me. So is there something else? I heard a little bit of a rumbling from some source that potentially they could do the delayed Kayla Harrison, Amanda Nunes fight on this card. I just don't know. And still some people are talking about Aspinall's Gone 2 taking place in October in Abu Dhabi rather than November at MSG. So my question would be, what happens to the reports of Sean Strickland wanting to fight in December? Is he still going to fight in December? Does he get moved up a month? Where do you put the Nunes-Harrison fight? There are a lot of questions that I have about this. So I guess the ultimate question is going to be if they do confirm Pantoja 2, the flyweight title fight, as the main event for 331 in California. Or is there going to be Oliveira Tsarukyan 2 plus 2 title fights? Remains to be seen. We also got confirmation that the very next week, Noche UFC 4, the 4th annual event for the UFC celebrating Mexican Independence Day weekend. We got John Silva versus Yair Rodriguez. This is, again, one of those fights where I say we've been spending most of our lives living in a striker's paradise. This is going to be fun. These two could probably slug it out. This would be a perfect way to celebrate Mexican Independence Day weekend with some UFC fights and be a perfect transition into later that night, the boxing card from Zuffa Boxing that features Conor Benn versus Ryan Garcia. One thing that I did note within the MMA headlines this week that I'm kind of riled up about is Walter Walker. And that's because Walter Walker, you guys have seen what I have said in previous episodes about Walter Walker, that I think he is one of the most, if not the most entertaining heavyweight right now on the UFC scene, a division that really, really needs some fresh faces. And Walter Walker, with his submission streak, this crazy submission streak that he's got going on, he needs top-level competition. He needs a big opportunity. So now that he's only got 1 fight left on his deal, he wants to renegotiate. And I know it sounds weird to say, maybe he doesn't have as much leverage because they've got Josh Hokett. I know Josh Hokett's not popular with a lot of people, but you consider the hate that he brings. There are some TKO and I know Dana White disparages some of the stuff that Josh Hokett says too and calls him an idiot, but there are people with suits over at that big corporation that Christie just said that she hates that probably only see social media numbers and dollar signs. They're like, yeah, we're going to, any publicity is good publicity kind of crowd. And they're like, yeah, let's do it with Hogan. But no, man, Walter Walker's where it's at in the heavyweight division. So maybe he does have a little bit of leverage here to get a better deal because, what else are they going to do? Book Alexander Rakic versus Marcin Tybura again? All right, PFL Charlotte. You got an interesting fight coming up here. Fun fight. Dalton Rasta, Brian Battle. Main event in Charlotte, North Carolina, Friday, August 7th. It should be an absolutely fun fight. You got Rasta, great wrestling base, great power in his fist. Brian Battle is a chaos agent striking. He's got solid submission threats that could possibly give some challenge to Dalton Rasta. I like Brian Battle. I like Dalton Rasta. Two solid talents. This will be fun. I think ultimately this one goes the distance. I've been going back and forth in my mind, people. I don't know. I think this one's going to be fun. Right now, if you ask me now, I'm going to give it to Battle by a close decision. I think if you ask me on Puncher's Chance, which might be on Thursday at this point again, or early Friday, maybe I'll have a different answer then. This one's a little too close to call. I just think it's going to be a lot of fun. And then on Saturday, you got UFC Vegas 120, back to the Apex. Main event, Matus Gamrot, Quillan Salkid. You're probably going to see Gamrot try to use his grappling, trying to clinch and hold Salkid and eliminate his offense. Salkid's probably going to want to stuff takedowns. He's probably going to want to keep fight at the distance because he can work the distance well with his striking. I'm going to take Salkid by decision at this point. And again, if you ask me on Thursday or Friday, whenever we do Puncher's Chance, I might have a different answer then. All right. So running out of time here when it comes to all the different topics that we're going to talk about. We have Test Your IQ. We're running out of time, and I need to get going soon, especially because we got Nate coming on for Give and Takes at 9 o'clock today. I'll just leave you off with some questions, do a little live read, and then we will sign off from here. So, pardon me. All right, so let's go over the questions, and then on next Monday, I'll go over 2 weeks worth of questions for you guys. Let's see. I have a whole bunch of questions here. Which one should we do? Okay, a little bit easier questions, but I think these are some good options. So, Yair Rodriguez, because we talked about the Noche UFC 4 main event he's got against John Silva. Yair Rodriguez holds the record for the latest knockout in UFC history. 4 minutes, 59 seconds of round number 5. With the legendary no-look elbow in 2018. Number 1, who was the fighter he knocked out? Number 2, what was significant about that card? Number 2, Matus Gamrot. Before he entered the octagon, he held championships in what major European MMA organization? Number 3, we'll do a tribute to the late Alan Nascimento. Again, thank you, Wayne, RIP. The late Alan Nascimento fought out a shoot box Diego Lima in Sao Paulo. Which former UFC champion is his most famous longtime training partner at that gym? An all-time submissions leader. And lastly, with the PFL set to rebrand under the MVP banner in 2027, we think back to their initial launch, when they rebranded from the World Series of Fighting and it was turned into the PFL. That inaugural season with the regular season and playoffs and championship format in 2018. Who won the lightweight championship during that year? So those are going to be your 4 questions. Uh-oh. All right. I got to get out of here really soon, guys. So I'm just going to do a very, 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 very quick live read. I just heard a really loud bang out there upstairs. So I really got to get out of here. Let me just tell you, though, that the road to kickoff starts here. Join Tom Albano and the ETB crew for Football Night on the Bench every Thursday during the NFL season at 7:15 p.m. Eastern, 4:15 p.m. Pacific. Leading you right up to Thursday Night Football, we got your real-time injury updates, weather conditions, and the betting analysis you need for the primetime window. Whether you're looking for a last-minute fantasy sub or the sharpest prop bets on the board, the gurus have you covered. Get locked in before the lights go up. Only on Empty the Bench Podcast Network. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/ETB Network. All right, quickly, I got to get out of here. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you get notified of everything here at the Empty the Bench Network. Shout out to all of you who are watching on X. Hit like, repost, quote post, and come to the YouTube home, youtube.com/ETB Network, and subscribe to us and help us grow on that platform. And then, of course, you can follow us on social media. Follow the show at FightIQ Follow the Empty the Bench Podcast Network at ETB Network. And follow me on social media at Thomas J. Albano. All right, we'll let you know if either late Thursday or early Friday, we're going to do the next edition of Puncher's Chance for PFL Charlotte and UFC Vegas 120. Next week, UFC 330 preview. We'll see you there on Monday night. Until then, this is Tom Albano saying good night. Good night.